All right, let's dive right in to another deep dive. And today, we're going to tackle a question that's been plaguing gym goers
Mhm.
for years. I mean, this is something that comes up all the time.
Yeah.
Does creatine cause hair loss? I mean, you want those games, right? But not if it's going to cost your hairline, right? So you've come to the right place if you want some answers. We've got all the research, articles, opinions from the experts. We've even got that rugby study, the infamous one, the one that started it all.
Yeah. It's actually kind of fascinating how one study from way back in 2009 managed to spark this whole myth that's just persisted for over a decade now.
It really has. Now, you might be wondering about this rugby study that everyone keeps talking about, right?
Yeah.
This is like where this whole myth originated, right?
Yeah.
It claimed that creatine caused a spike in DHT levels. And DHT, of course, that's a hormone that's linked to male pattern baldness. And that sounds pretty scary, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But like a lot of things in the world of fitness, it's not quite that simple.
No, it's not. It's a lot more nuanced than that. The study, it definitely had its limitations. For one thing, it only measured DHT. It didn't measure actual hair loss. So, it's kind of like saying just because there's a cloud in the sky, that means it's going to rain
Yeah.
without actually checking to see if it's actually raining.
Yeah, good analogy.
And also, the sample size was so tiny, it was only 20 rugby players. So that's not exactly representative of the entire population, is it?
No, it's not a very big sample size at all. So,
Okay, so maybe we shouldn't be hitting the panic button just yet then.
no.
But this study, it did find a pretty significant increase in DHT, didn't it?
It did. It found the DHT levels went up by a, well, pretty huge amount, 56%,
Mm-hmm.
after only 7 days of creatine loading. That's when you take a higher dose initially to sort of saturate the muscles. And even after they drop down to a normal dose, the DHT levels still remain 40% higher, even after 2 weeks. Wow, those are some pretty big numbers. I can see why people got worried. But if this study was so limited, what does the more recent research tell us about all this?
Well, a lot has changed since 2009. A lot of research has been done. And actually, between 2023 and 2024 alone, at least 4 separate studies have actually tackled this whole question head on. And get this, all 4 came to the same conclusion.
Let me guess, creatine doesn't actually cause hair loss.
You got it. These studies, they involved hundreds of participants, and they just found no real conclusive link between creatine use and hair loss. For example, one study that was published in the MDPI journal, it compared athletes who used creatine to athletes who didn't, and guess what? No difference in DHT levels or hair loss.
Wow, hold on. 4 studies all debunking this whole myth. I mean, are we saying that this hair loss thing is totally bogus?
Well, not so fast. While the evidence really points to creatine being safe for your hair, there is a nuance here that we need to kind of unpack a little bit.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. You mentioned before that DHT is linked to male pattern baldness. So how does that all fit into all this?
That's the crucial point. DHT, it can contribute to hair loss, that's true, but only if you're already genetically predisposed to it. It all comes down to your genes and how sensitive your hair follicles are to DHT.
So let me get this straight. If my dad, let's say, went bald, does that automatically mean that I'm doomed to go bald, even if I don't touch creatine at all?
Not necessarily, no. It might mean that you are more susceptible, more vulnerable to the effects of DHT, but it definitely doesn't mean that you are absolutely guaranteed to lose your hair, no. And also, and this is really important, remember that there are medications specifically designed to block DHT. Finasteride is a really good example of that.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that.
And those can really help prevent hair loss.
Okay, so genetics, they definitely play a role in all this, but it's not a guaranteed outcome.
Right.
Okay, so bringing it all back to creatine now. Some of the studies did show that there was a potential for a rise in DHT, right? How much of a rise are we talking? And is it really enough to actually cause hair loss?
Well, yeah, some studies, they did show a small increase in DHT, usually around 10 to 20%, but that's nothing close to the levels that would cause really noticeable hair loss. Remember that 56% jump in that rugby study?
Yeah.
We're not seeing anything even remotely close to that in all the newer research.
Okay, so let's recap a little. We've looked at that rugby study. That's the one that really sparked the myth in the first place. And then we looked at four more recent studies that basically debunked it. We've talked about DHT, and we've talked about how genetics play a role in all this. But I know some people listening might still be a little hesitant about using creatine. So let's kind of distill all this information down into some really clear takeaways for our listeners. What does all of this actually mean for somebody out there who's listening and is worried about their hair?
Absolutely, yeah. Let's get down to brass tacks.
Okay, so after all that research and all those big DHT numbers being thrown around, what's the bottom line here? Should someone who's worried about their hair, should they just stay away from creatine altogether?
Here's the honest truth. Creatine does not directly cause hair loss. I mean, that's really the biggest takeaway from all this research.
Okay, that's a huge relief. I bet there are a lot of people out there listening right now who are breathing a sigh of relief. But you did say there were some nuances.
Right. If you're, let's say, already genetically predisposed to male pattern baldness, like maybe your dad lost his hair, then yeah, there's a tiny, and I mean a tiny chance that creatine could, maybe slightly accelerate hair loss that's already happening. But the evidence for that, I mean, it's very, very weak. And even then, the impact is probably pretty minimal.
So basically what you're saying is creatine's not going to just, magically make your hair fall out. But if you're already kind of on that path to baldness, it might just speed things up a little.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And if you have no family history of baldness at all, there's no reason to worry. Creatine is a very safe, very effective supplement. And, those feels about hair loss, they're largely unfounded.
This whole conversation has been super eye-opening for me. It's kind of amazing how one study, way back when, can spark a myth that just persists for years and years and years, even when all this new research comes out that pretty much debunks it.
Yeah, it really shows you the power of misinformation, especially in the fitness world. Everybody's always looking for that edge, that one little secret. But you got to remember, solid evidence, I mean, it trumps those sensational headlines every time.
I couldn't agree more. Solid evidence for the win. But this whole thing has got me thinking, are there any other fitness myths out there that we should be debunking? I mean, you must come across so many kind of questionable claims in your research. I mean, it's got to be just a ton of them
Yeah.
out there.
Oh, there are tons. You wouldn't believe some of the stuff that's out there.
Yeah.
Fad diets, miracle workouts, supplements that promise they're going to do everything but your taxes. It's a minefield out there.
So how can our listeners out there become a little more savvy, a little more aware, when they're bombarded with all this fitness information? I mean, what are some red flags they should watch out for?
That's a great question. First and foremost, look for credible sources. Peer-reviewed studies, reputable organizations like the American College of Sports Medicine, or qualified professionals like, a registered dietitian. Those are your go-tos. Steer clear of, anecdotal evidence, those big sensational headlines, or anybody who's trying to sell you something that just sounds way too good to be true.
Makes sense. Basically, don't just believe everything you read on social media, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And remember, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this stuff. Fitness and health. What works for one person might not work for somebody else.
So true. We all have different bodies, different goals, different lifestyles. It's really all about finding what works best for you as an individual. And sometimes that means kind of debunking some of those, deeply ingrained myths along the way.
Couldn't agree more. And that's why we do what we do here on the Deep Dive. We try to empower you with knowledge so you can make informed decisions about your health and fitness.
So wrapping things up, if you're thinking about adding creatine to your fitness routine, don't let all those unfounded fears about hair loss hold you back. The science is pretty clear here. It just doesn't support it.
Yeah, and if you're still a little unsure, remember, knowledge is power. Keep learning, keep asking those questions, and always, always prioritize your health and well-being.
It's actually a great segue into our final thought for today. This whole discussion about creatine and hair loss has got me thinking. What other fitness myths are out there just waiting to be busted? I mean, what other fitness myths are out there? These things that people take as gospel, but when you really dig into it, they're not really based on anything solid.
Oh, there are, I mean, you could do a whole series on this. Where do we even begin? I mean, there are so many of these misconceptions just floating around out there. Like, that old one, you got to do tons and tons of crunches if you want to get a six-pack.
Oh yeah, that's a classic. Or how about this one, that lifting weights is going to make women bulky? I mean, come
Oh,
on.
that one drives me crazy. Or the idea that you have to do like hours and hours of cardio every single day if you want to lose weight. These myths are everywhere. I mean, it's unbelievable. And they can be so misleading, especially for people who are new to fitness.
It's like everybody's looking for that quick fix, that magic bullet. But the reality is, real health and real fitness, they just don't work that way.
No, they don't. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes a really good understanding of the science. And that's why it's so important, so crucial to be critical thinkers. Don't just accept everything you hear, at face value, do your research.
Exactly. Question everything. So what can our listeners do to avoid falling for these fitness fallacies? Any tips for navigating this jungle of misinformation?
Well, first of all, always question your assumptions, right? Just because something has been repeated over and over and over again for years, I mean, that doesn't automatically make it true. Second, do your research. And I don't mean, just skimming a few headlines or watching a YouTube video. Dig a little deeper. Consult those reputable sources that we talked about. Look for evidence-based information.
And don't be afraid to, reach out to a qualified professional if you're not really sure about something. There's absolutely no shame in asking for help.
None at all. I mean, registered dietitian, they can really help you separate fact from fiction when it comes to nutrition. And a certified personal trainer can guide you towards those, safe and effective workout routines. So don't be afraid to reach out and get some expert advice.
Well, I think that about wraps things up for us today. We busted that myth about creatine and hair loss. We explored some other common fitness misconceptions that are out there. And most importantly, we've given you the tools to become a more informed, more discerning consumer of health and wellness information.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power. And by empowering ourselves with the facts, we can make smarter, healthier choices that support our overall well-being.
Well said. Now, before we sign off, we want to hear from you. What other fitness myths are you curious about? What are you wondering about? Head over to our website or our social media and let us know. Maybe we'll tackle your question in a future deep dive.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Until then, stay curious, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
And that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time.